Hello, this is Ben Russo from Ben Russo Studio from the UK. This is US Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to US Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. I'm Tom Guile. Today's show features a fascinating discussion with architectural historian Sian Winship, Minnesota's MVP for mid-century modern Bobak, playground designer Spencer Luckey, and we close with a lovely track from jazz pianist Lenore Raphael. And now, your host, Mr. Modernism, George Smart.
Thanks, Tom. The last few years brought us the newest big thing, AI. We're told it's going to speed up manufacturing, make things cheaper, create more leisure time, and other empty promises we heard when the first desktop computers came out decades ago. Don't get me wrong, I'm no Luddite, and I use tech voraciously every day. But the overpromising continues. We were advised AI was coming in 1984 through the Terminator movies, where the AI creation Skynet brought about the end of most of humanity. I've been experimenting with AI lately, and the results have been interesting. I asked Gemini to discuss an article in the December 1980 issue of Interiors magazine about 7 notable Los Angeles architects: Frank Gehry, Charles Moore, Cesar Pelli, Arthur Erickson, Ricardo Legarreta, Barton Myers, and Anthony Lumsden. The Interiors article wasn't just a glossy feature, it was a significant moment for these practitioners and solidified their status as leading figures in architecture, with a West Coast vibe different from other noted groups like the New York Five, or even Ray Cappy and the SciArt crew in LA. Fast forward to today, and the resonance of that 1980 gathering continues. Past podcast guest, filmmaker Russell Brown, founder of Fort LA and advisory board member for the Neutra Institute, has brought this moment back to life with a captivating short film, reuniting 4 of the original 7 with the article's photographer and reflecting on their careers, architecture of the past 40 years, and the enduring legacy of that day. While details about the film are still under wraps, the prospect of hearing these architects discuss their shared journeys promises to be fascinating. It sounds great, right? Except AI got 6 of the 7 architects wrong. Frank Gehry, yes, but the other 6 were actually Frederick Fisher, Robert Mangurian, Michael Rotondi, Coy Howard, Craig Hodgetts, and Tom Main.
What?
Be careful out there. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs.
Sian Winship is an architectural historian, preservation powerhouse, and former movie star. A graduate of the University of Southern California,
Go Trojans!
She is a leading voice in recognizing women's contributions to architecture, and she serves on the board of the Neutra Institute for Survival Through Design. Here's George's conversation with Sian Winship.
Sian, before we talk about architecture, which you are quite the expert at, I understand you were in a movie one time. What's the Matter with Helen? How was that to work with Debbie Reynolds and Agnes Moorehead and Shelley Winters and all those kids in that production?
It was a lot of fun, George. My mother had been a Meglin Kitty in Los Angeles. She grew up in Los Angeles. She had also been in the film Ziegfeld Girl. And at one point, she decided to give me dance lessons, and she decided that my head was getting a little bit too big, so she took me to a big Hollywood audition for a film called What's the Matter with Helen? And they chose a dozen little girls, and I think much to her chagrin, they chose me. So what was supposed to be a life lesson kind of backfired.
And this was some kind of horror film, I take it? I didn't see it, but what was the plot of the film?
The film is basically a version of What Happened to Baby Jane.
Okay.
It's about 2 women who come to Los Angeles in the 1930s because their sons have committed a double murder somewhere in the Midwest. and they reinvent themselves. And Debbie Reynolds starts a dance studio, and Shelley Winters is the piano player. And spoiler alert, in case you are going to see it, Debbie Reynolds dies at the end. But
Oh, no.
Shelley Winters did it. So
Well, this was during that time in Hollywood where all the 50s glamour women were doing thrillers and horror films. Betty Davis and Joan Crawford and that whole gang were doing those in the 70s.
yeah, it was a time when there wasn't a lot of opportunity for older, and I put that in air quotes, older women in movies and film. And so some of these roles were, we'll say, less than ideal. How about that?
So what led you from the world of dance to the world of architecture?
Well, I took a left turn because I didn't go straight from the world of dance to the world of architecture. I went via marketing and advertising.
Okay.
For years, my first career was actually working in advertising for Chiat Day, and I suppose working at Chiat Day in the Frank Gehry designed building was kind of a collision course between
Yes.
advertising and architecture. So it was, very much a stepping stone into the built environment. But yeah, that was my career for 25 years.
Chiat Day was a really big, important ad agency, wasn't it?
Yeah, if you ask them, they probably would say they still are. They're most famous probably for the Apple 1984 commercial,
Okay.
which was sort of this dystopian view of the future and computers that we are now realizing. But yeah, they've been around for probably 50 years at this point. But yeah, one of the leading creative agencies in the country.
So what kind of work were you doing at the agency?
I was doing research and account management. So my love for research then, I was applying to cars and whatever the product of the day was. And now I try to use those same skills in ferreting out information about buildings and
Oh,
architects.
yeah. It's super fun, isn't it?
I love it. It fulfills my dream. I've always wanted to be a private detective. Just all my clients are dead now. So
Me too. Yeah, it's that whole Scooby-Doo thing, right?
well, I think it was Esther McCoy who was famous for saying she wrote a short article called "Wanted an Architect, Preferably a Dead One." So I can relate to that these days.
You have been involved with the Society for Architectural Historians, Southern California chapter for 16, 17 years now?
It's longer than that. So that would be 1997, and I can't do the math that quickly, but I got to believe we're close to 30 years.
30
on that.
years. What got you started with that August group?
Interestingly, I took an extension class at UCLA that was a class all about a comparison and contrast between Neutra and Schindler. And we met probably about 12 weeks during the summer. And every Wednesday night or whatever it was, we would see one Schindler and one Neutra and talk about it.
Wait a second, you got to visit one Schindler and one Neutra every Wednesday night?
Yes.
That's pretty cool.
It was fantastic. And of course, at that time, there were a lot of original owners who still lived in those homes. And they were mostly in their original conditions. And, it was half architectural history, half car rally, because as you can well imagine, we were driving all over the city to see these homes.
So you got hooked up with SAH through that, and then you started working on their newsletter in some volunteer capacity?
I definitely met people in that class who were board members of the SAH, and then they sort of recruited me to create a tour that was part of the LACMA exhibit at the time, which was Exiles and Emigres. And I suggested that we do the architecture component. They were doing, of course, the fine art component. And that was sort of my first event, which was 2 consecutive weekends, one on the west side, one in Silver Lake, where we looked at, not surprisingly, Neutra, but other, kind of quasi-emigre architects.
That sounds fascinating. You were still working, I guess, at Chiat Day at that time, right?
Yes, I was.
And then you decided to go back and get a master's.
Yeah, so, it's been a circuitous route through life. So I did leave sort of traditional marketing and advertising, and I went into social issue marketing. So essentially doing some of the research work and using the same techniques I'd been doing for products, but doing it on social issues. And in that capacity, my clients were people like the Ford Foundation, the Casey Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation. It was very much kind of high-level nonprofit world. And I decided I would go out on my own, create my own business in 2008. And it was about 48 hours later that the economy went down, down, down. And I realized it was not the right time to start my own consulting business. And then I just decided to go back to school and get a master's degree and use that time wisely. And so here I am on my, I don't know how many we've counted here, fourth career as a preservation professional and an architectural historian, for real.
For real. So what does an architectural historian do in 2025?
Well, we do any number of things. We write books. As I mentioned, I'm also, a preservation professional, so I write a lot of historic context statements. We do a lot of survey work. I'm very pleased to have been the lead author for the award-winning Japanese-American historic context statement for Survey LA, and then also for the women's rights context for Survey LA. And that has now led me to a teaching job at USC. This is my first semester molding young minds, and we're doing it all about the preservation of women's history in Los Angeles.
Oh, is that all of women's history or architectural history?
All of women's history. So, for example, our class project this year is to have the students amend local landmark nominations that already exist. So, to give you an example of how errant some of them are, the nomination for the Eames House here in Pacific Palisades was designated only for its association with Charles Eames and not for its association with Ray.
Really?
Yeah.
As famous as she was, it's so surprising they would continue to overlook her, but I guess that was just what people did.
Yeah, that's the case in a lot of these nominations. And so each of my 12 students right now has got their own project where they're writing women back into the history books.
You have been involved with a great new book on the Palm Springs School of Architecture. Just came out. What is that book all about?
Well, it's Alan Hess's love letter to Palm Springs. And I think that his way of framing the architects that worked in the desert area as a school of architects is really quite brilliant. We've all looked at Palm Springs for many years now, but his approach really brings it all into a cohesion that tells you why the Palm Springs School of Architecture is so special and so unique.
I know that Sarasota has gone that route. They have the Sarasota School. I keep wondering when there's going to be a big game we can see the teams play each other. I want the T-shirt, right?
Well, I want home field advantage. Thank you.
What part of the book did you work on? What pieces of it were you putting together, or what band of material were you researching?
So my essay is actually on the role of the Agua Caliente band of Cohilla Indians and how they contributed to the Palm Springs built environment. When Alan gave me the assignment, I frankly had no idea what I was going to write about. It turned out I did some deep research and found a miracle document that told me all about the Indian land leases that started to happen in the 1960s and into the 1970s. And the great concentration of them are basically in the south end of Palm Springs. So inadvertently, the tribe and their ability to lease land to large developers and large developments really changed the face of Palm Springs in the south end. And that's why there's such a powerful concentration of modern architecture, mid-century modern architecture in the south end of the city.
Was the tribe ever into modernist architecture itself for its own buildings and structures?
What an interesting question that is. And the answer is yes. One of the things that I located was a master plan that the tribe had engaged Victor Gruen.
Sure, yeah.
Well known as a master planner, architect, also well known as, sort of the father of the air-conditioned shopping mall, if you will. They engaged Gruen and Associates to create a master plan for what was known as and still is known as Section 14, their tribal square in the checkerboard, which is directly adjacent to downtown Palm Springs. And the Gruen master plan included, not surprisingly, a shopping center, hotels, residential and commercial development, and all of it was in the mid-century modern style. So in the Section 14 master plan, there are several renderings that show what would have been a mid-century modern tribal reservation.
What year was that, approximately?
About 1955.
1955. And it wasn't until about 5-10 years ago that they built the Cultural Center in Palm Springs.
Yes.
Is that Section 14 right there?
That is Section 14, exactly.
Okay. So I wonder what the delay was in that building project.
Well, without getting too far in the weeds here,
Yeah.
what I can tell you is that tribal land was owned in combination. So it was owned individually by some members of the tribe and then collectively. And for the Gruen Master Plan to have come to fruition, it required that basically everyone cooperate with one another.
Ah, yes.
And there were so many members of the tribe that had very good reason not to be trustful of a master planning exercise by an outside firm that it was impossible for the then tribal leader, Viola Ortner, and the all-woman tribal council to get everyone to agree to do the Gruen Master Plan.
And were they the same women who went to Washington to get the leases changed from 5 years to 99 years?
Exactly. And so that whole process took almost 6 or 7 or 8 years from the time they started that effort until they got to the 99-year lease. You know, the Palm Springs Spa by Sam Banowit was a very early project when the lease terms were still 25 years of lease and then an option for 25 years more. But really, that wasn't enough to attract the major developers. They really needed that 99-year lease term. And it was that was the catalyst for Section 30, which is the area right below the turn of 111 in the South End. And that was the catalyst for all the big developers coming in, creating golf course development as we know it today, creating Seven Lakes, which is the very first golf course condominium development. Mm-hmm. Without those lease terms, it never would have happened.
And I noticed that a good chunk of the airport is on tribal land.
Yes, that was also on tribal land. The airport was taken over by the military during World War II. And then after that, the city was able to buy the land. But that also required approval of the Bureau of, I believe it's Land Management, the BLM,
Right.
which was overseeing all of the Indian affairs.
It's just a fascinating story about the evolution of the tribe and the evolution of modernism and the evolution of this great leisure center all happening at the same time there.
I mean, the other thing that would have only come about with this strange lease term arrangement was the rise of upscale trailer parks. I write about that in the essay as well. You know, upscale trailer parks, when the lease terms were really short, were some of the only things that made sense because no developer wanted to spend a lot of money on infrastructure that they might not possibly own. So they created Sahara Trailer Park and some others down there in the South End, which is a really kind of unique, once again, character-defining feature of Palm Springs, frankly.
That's so cool. I know there's some famous upscale trailer park, I think, in Malibu now. It's not on tribal land, but it is.
Maybe there was. I'm not sure it's there now.
I hope it's still around.
Not sure about that.
You have been very involved in doing National Register nominations for different kinds of buildings. I know many homeowners I've talked to have thought about that because their houses have been designed by well-known architects. So what does it take to do a National Register nomination? How long does it take? Is it something people can do themselves, or are they better off hiring a consultant to write that up for them?
Well, the great answer to that is it depends, George.
Okay, all right.
I will say that generally speaking, National Register nominations require a great deal more research and in-depth research and writing than a local designation. National Register requirements are quite extensive. And, it's not only just for architectural merit. We can also find significance for the association with historic personages or with broad patterns of history. There are other types of and other ways that buildings are significant, but it can take, 6 months or so, depending upon what kind of resources you have, to put all that together and submit it to the State Historic Preservation Office.
So it goes to the state first, and then how long do they take to chew on that?
That also depends. It depends on what kind of workload there is, how many people are on staff, what else it might be in the queue. I generally tell people that probably 1 year from the date that we start, we'll be listed on the National Register.
So does the state decide that, or does it get bumped up to a federal level?
Well, here in California, the State Historic Preservation Office is very well respected by the federal government. And so if the application is determined to be worthy and is accepted at the California state level, it's pretty much a rubber stamp at the federal level. I don't think it works that way in all states. We're
Okay.
just very fortunate that we have good reviewers here.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So do you get to talk with college students who are thinking about a career as architectural historians?
Every Wednesday from 2 to 5 p.m., yes.
And what has emerged in the field lately? What's exciting about this profession for them and for you?
I'm struck by how many of my students really want to make a difference. They're very interested in social justice issues. And that's why offering a class like this about preserving women's history and preserving sites and adding women's history back into the canon, if you will, was very appealing to them. And when we went around the room at the very beginning and introduced ourselves and I heard all about their thesis topics, I was really struck at how much the type of students has changed and the profile has changed, where we have a real generation of folks who are interested in social justice issues, not just pretty buildings.
That's really cool. Sian, thank you so much for talking with me. This has been quite a pleasure.
Well, thank you, George.
Bobak Hayeri is a professor, architectural historian, and preservationist known for his leadership with Docomomo, Minnesota, where he developed the award-winning Minnesota Modern Registry, an extensive digital archive documenting over 9,000 modernist structures statewide. Through lectures, tours, and research, he champions the recognition and protection of mid-century architecture. He also shares on Instagram his collection of incredible miniature architectural models.
So, Bobak, I have been fascinated in learning about your background. We met like 10, 12 years ago when we were talking about Ralph Rapson, the noted architect in Minnesota who did so many wonderful buildings and houses. But since then, I've learned you were pre-med in your first year of college. You were in a Butthole Surfers music video. You're a frequent contributor to Wikipedia. You're a member of the Football Writers Association of America, covering football. You research and lecture on modern architecture in Minnesota. And I believe, if I'm not wrong, that you put a number of condoms on bananas. Is that all true?
Yeah, gosh. That's certainly, man, is that what my obituary is going to sound like? You know? How are you doing?
I am doing fine. It's so nice to meet you in person here. We're recording this over Zoom. I wish you could see us talking to each other. Bobak, tell me about how you fell into love with modern architecture.
That is a great question. So I grew up in, I would say, somewhat of a cultural backwater. I mean, I was born in Toronto, but we moved when I was younger because I was getting sick with the cold to Bakersfield, California, in the armpit of the state. And I served 15 years there before I went to college.
It does have a Neutra house, I believe, and a Frank Lloyd Wright house, right?
Well, and those things came up quite a bit later for me, and I can circle back to that. Because the thing about Bakersfield was, and I didn't appreciate that, it actually has a lot of mid-century architecture, because nothing will cause that kind of a change like a nice earthquake in 1952, which brought down all the traditional buildings, so they had to replace everything. So it was actually, in the early 50s, mid-50s, it was actually bonanza for a lot of design. Now, there's a Frank Lloyd Wright house that turns out it was actually not far from where I grew up. I'd never seen it. My mom and dad never thought to take me to visit that doctor who was a friend of theirs. But I always knew their gate. Their gate was unmistakable with the geometry that you would associate with Wright's style. It was one of the many houses Wright designed, but right before he died. So, like, we have one in the Twin Cities as well, where it's like, you know, he designed it, and then by the time it was finished, he was no longer with us. But yeah, there's actually two Neutra houses. One is lesser, well, they're both lesser known, but one of them is a little bit more of the traditional kind of style where you associate with him, almost even calling back to kind of the more international style. The other one is a little later. It was actually, I want to say 20 years later. And then he designed a gas station, which still is out there, but it's been encased so much that it doesn't look like his gas station. It's not like the Frank Lloyd Wright gas station out up north here in Minnesota, which actually still very much looks like a Wright product.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I was out there. I always enjoyed travel. I was lucky. My parents took me around the world. I was an only child. It was easy just to pack me in a bag and take them along. And I always enjoyed seeing all kinds of buildings. And then when I went to college, I chose USC, where I was actually pre-med theater because I had really no idea what I wanted to do, and then ended up doing international relations. But while I was there, I was like, I enjoy learning about buildings, about place, not only about traditional structures, but really I picked up books from like the local architectural scene and notable buildings throughout the LA area. Obviously, there's a lot, and a lot of it tends to be modern. And in that case, I started to really appreciate that. I'm like, man, I would really like to study architecture. Of course, at a school like USC, if you transferred into the architecture program, it was 5 years from the day you got there. I was already in college for 2 years. And, Tommy Boy came out around this time. It's like a lot of people go to college for 7 years. They're called doctors. And so I actually graduated in 3 years of college and 3 years of law school. So I actually did it all together in 6, right? So for me, I'm like, I don't think I can do that. But I always thought, one day I'm going to hire an architect. And I did. I hired a local architect. I admired their work a lot. So I'm recording this from the house I had designed. And then in the process, it's interesting too. It was always in the back of my head. I used to buy like Architectural Record every month and read through it and kind of be intrigued, especially by the pictures and especially listening to the write-ups of what the designers were thinking and why they designed things the way they did. So that when I was actually in the process of designing this house, I decided, it was such a silly idea. I'm going to map every modern house I can find in the state of Minnesota. That was the original plan. And, this is a little bit more reasonable than like Palm Springs, where you're not getting out of that city.
Right.
So I started doing that, and I was kind of doing it for fun. And then when I was at Design Within Reach in the Twin Cities, just buying a piece of furniture my architect had recommended, I got talking with someone there, and they're like, there's a local organization you should join. It's all about primarily the mid-century. So they were looking for a board member, especially one with a legal background, because their previous one had moved away. So I stepped in. And then next thing you know, I'm like, hey, can I make a map? And they're like, we've always wanted to make a map. And then next thing you know, they gave me a bunch of lists that were totally disorganized, very much. I had a friend who understands how Excel works, kind of helped me turn them into one kind of standardized form. And then I just started adding to it. And your website, by the way, I have to say, US Modernist, before this, I was curious when I first started doing the initial, like my personal, I'm going to map houses. Rapson's, of course, one of the most famous architects of the Twin Cities. And I saw you had a great list of his work. So I'm like, oh, some of these don't have pictures yet. And some of these, I don't know where they are. So we're lucky in that the University of Minnesota has the Northwest Architectural Archives, which are a good collection of architectural papers and all kinds of things related to it. And they had Rapson's papers. So I got them to pull all the buildings that you didn't have. And we were able to figure out some of them just weren't built. Some of them were demolished. One of them, my favorite was, and it made sense why it was on the list, it was a house of leather and suede. And as it turns out, that was the early name of what became Wilson's Leather, like a mall shop that was in many malls in America. They're all, I think, gone now. But it was like a leather shop. So Rapson had actually just designed a storefront in a building and designed like these cool looking like bags and things like that.
Oh, yeah.
So,
I remember that. Yeah.
But yeah, so that's kind of where it came about. And then it's just been this kind of side thing I go through. I mean, I sometimes don't sleep very much, and I will just stay up all night looking up information, and then it becomes kind of this big, beautiful tapestry. Like, I'm a person who loves history. Everything is one big story. Everything connects. And then when you do something like architectural history, it really, really builds, especially things like this, where over time you start to see patterns that you didn't see before. You start to see like, oh, if I see a Google Street, if I see a picture of a house like that's 600 miles away, I'm like, oh, I know who did that because I know I can see the signs. I can see that someone like Liza Close, towards the end of her career, she loved to do these clerestory window strips that were above her living room. They'd always, for some reason, point at the street. I never understood that, but you'd always be able to see when I think there's a house by her in this neighborhood. Boom, there you go. I can see it. It's right there. So anywho.
Can people see this map now? It is online somewhere?
Oh, yeah. The easiest way to find it is go to the chapter website for Docomomo US. Or frankly, if you just Google Minnesota Modern Map, you'll get it. We've tried to make sure that it is. I mean, it's not like it's competing with others, right? But yeah, the Minnesota Modern Map, you'll find it. I have proven the limits of what Google Maps are able to do, the My Maps that you can design. I mean, it is They say you can only have like 1,000 points on any layer. No, we're past 2,000 on a couple of them.
That's fantastic.
The registry which backs it is probably the more valuable piece. There is a Excel spreadsheet, and everything is multiple entered. Really, when you have that many data points, how do you break it down? Because I'm trying to track the modernist movement from its early, and in the Twin Cities, let's be clear here. In Minnesota, the modernist movement can credibly be traced back to 1898. And as anyone who understands modernism knows, it's not just the aesthetic design. And even then, obviously, if you want to go to the earliest reaches of modernism, not just the prairie, but modernisme and all the designs of Europe in that era that started to break convention. But really, it's technology. And that's where Minnesota actually has a really funny history in that, because there is an item in, now it's a first-ring suburb of St. Louis Park, Minnesota, the P.B. Hagelin experimental concrete grain elevator. It is a National Historic Landmark since the 70s because it is the first concrete grain elevator. Like, they were so nervous about what was going to happen that they built it outside of the city because they thought it might blow up or collapse. So this concrete cylinder, we take them for granted, especially if you live near anywhere that was a shipping area at one point or another. That was the first one. And then this concrete grain elevator inspires concrete grain elevators throughout the nation. It starts to spread all the way to the East Coast, especially through the Great Lakes. As I mentioned, Buffalo has many of them. And meanwhile, in Europe, a young Walter Gropius is trying to kind of articulate modernism, and he's helping develop this. And in the 19-teens, he starts to collect photos of factories and grain elevators in the United States. I mean, obviously, Detroit at that point was where many of the factories and the architects were for that, obviously with Kahn and company and all of them, the elder Kahn. The grain elevators he started to grab, I heard he then turned this presentation, which for all intents and purposes sounds like he was showing slides and then talking about it. He published it in a German progressive magazine. By chance, I looked up Abe Books and I got a copy of it for $25. It wasn't the greatest condition, but it was. So I found this, and then in that, they reproduced half of the slides. And one of the slides was not the P.V. Hagelin, but one of the buildings here in downtown Minneapolis, the grain elevator, that had inspired him. I don't think he ever stepped a foot in Minneapolis at any point in his life. And if he did, it was far past this point. But it was interesting to see how those things had kind of inspired even the Europeans. Because as we know, his presentation was so important. Like, Le Corbusier famously took images from it and then cleaned them up even more to make them look even more clean, to kind of show his version of modernism. And it was all because of things that were designed. They loved the monumentality, the Egyptian monumentality, these giant grain elevator things. And it's all because these guys decided to throw this thing up in suburban Minneapolis to kind of see how it would work. They ran for about a year. Then they did another couple of layers of circular concrete on top of it. And it's still out there. It's really funny because most people just know it as the Nordic Wear sign because this company has their factory next to it, and they restored it many years ago. And the agreement was they could paint their logo on the side of it.
On the side of it.
But this grain elevator is absolutely one of the more important things there. I mean, it's fascinating, too. There is a church in suburban Minneapolis in Excelsior, and it's from the 1860s. It is one of the earliest uses of concrete ever. It's not a modernist exterior. The earliest modern concrete building, or I should say building using modern concrete, is in Wisconsin. It's only a few years older. For some reason out here, they were trying to come up with these ways. So they were just doing framing, and this church, which otherwise is just your normal gable church, if you look carefully at the sides of it, you can see the concrete pours that they did to try and build this thing up. So the functional kind of technological aspect of modernism has some very, very early roots here. But it's absolutely fantastic to see that and the impact it had as a kind of spread.
Well, help me connect the dots here. So was this grain elevator the building that you mentioned that's from 1898?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, that's really early.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's super early.
I mean, that's the thing. Most people think of modernism as just that ugly apartment box near their house. And it's like, no, it's so much more than that. One of the things that has been enjoyable about doing a project like this map is it forces me to kind of dig deep. Because, I mean, in order to populate it, you can get a list of cool buildings you saw, but that doesn't always do it all. I mean, and frankly, sometimes the buildings that have been defaced or mismanaged or even demolished are just as important. I mean, to understand where they were at and how they were designed. So to do that, for example, your site, I love your site. I'm not a hired person to come talk about it, but the fact is, I remember I went through the entirety of progressive architecture all the way from pencil points on, just to kind of find mentions of Minneapolis, mentions of Minnesota. Thank goodness I can Control F find on those documents, because otherwise I would have taken a lot longer.
Yeah.
But trying to find those things and learning which minds were the most respected among their peers, quite frankly. You learn that someone like Robert Cerny, who was at the University of Minnesota with Ralph Rapson. First of all, the University of Minnesota is one of the reasons why we have so many good architects from that era. They were only hiring faculty that were practicing. And that was from Roy Childs Jones, the predecessor to Ralph Rapson, had created this idea of how, especially during the post-war era, how the university was going to teach architects. And Rapson continued that and hired some exceptional minds. And together, not only were they teaching the next generation of architects, but they were designing some fantastic works. Another good example of that would be, of course, Liesl Close, who had a great book written about her recently.
Yes, we've had the author of that book.
Yeah, she's a great person. She's a friend. So she did some great research on that. They were a husband-wife team, both fellows of the American Institute of Architects. And we also have, by the way, another couple who were actually father-son who both became fellows. I love those kinds of weird rarities of people and relations. And Winston Close, too, was a great architect, although he tended to be more of a planner. The university used him a lot for a lot of the university-wide planning, while Liesl did a lot more of the, especially house architecture, which was in a way, as much as she broke barriers, it was still a legacy of the patriarchal society that she was a bit pigeonholed to doing residential architecture for many years of hers. But these kinds of things are always fascinating to see develop out as you kind of build this. And also as, going through progressive architecture, going through the entire lineup of the American Institute of Architects Journal. Okay, not the entire. Usually I'll start basically where they begin, but I'm trying to do a soft cutoff of about 1984, which doesn't feel all that long ago, but that was still peak when postmodernism was still kind of really, really interesting when we're talking about that movement. Beyond that, especially as working with Docomomo, when we're talking about the modernist movement, we're not quite there yet. I remember we really put a cold feeling on a lot of folks when we had there was a national theme that was the 70s turned 50 a couple years ago.
Yeah.
And, it's like, no, but that's important. There's buildings now that can be on the National Register of Historic Places. There's buildings here that are historic. Yes, you may be old enough to remember when they were built, but they're still important. And I'm going to probably be preaching to the choir of some of your listeners who've ever worked in historical preservation, but you go to Historical Society in most places, I tell them, hey, I'm interested in knowing about this building. And I've done that before in some of these small towns, and they look at me like I'm bonkers that I want to talk about this building. They go, don't you want to talk about the Pioneer Cabin, blah, 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 okay, cool. I know farms and cabins are like part and parcel with the prairie out here. I mean, Little Home on the Prairie was set out here. I get it. But there are some other interesting structures that have been built in the ensuing 120 years. So can we talk about some of those as well? We have this museum here in the Twin Cities called the Walker Art Center. It's a fascinating modern museum. It's one of the better modern art museums in the nation. It's got a very cool modernist building that was built by Edward Larrabee.
Barnes,
yeah. It's one of his more minimalist works. Everything kind of does harken back to some of Frank Lloyd Wright work. But anyway, the whole story of that was a fascinating kind of newspaper story where you find out that people were kind of avoiding stories about the relationships of people. Like this building originally, before the Barnes edition, it was, a traditional museum. It was just some wealthy lumber magnate had funded it. It was like the Walker Art Gallery at that point. And then meanwhile, because of what was going on in the New Deal, there were a lot of the WPA, a lot of artists were being supported. And one of these young people was creating the Art Center movement, which is he would go around and he'd create moments of designing art all around the country. The guy was based in North Carolina. And he realized that the funding for that was coming to an end. So he's like, I'm going to create my permanent job. So he moves to the Twin Cities, and the Walkers like him. He romances their daughter. They get married, and then the Walker Art Gallery becomes a Walker Art Center and focuses on modernism movement and really kind of these really interesting cutting-edge progressive designs and progressive exhibitions. And then he kind of vanishes off the face of the earth. And I'm like, why does he just vanish? Why does this guy vanish in all of our stories? Then you start digging through the newspapers. Then you find stories like, oh, by the way, he's suddenly going on a leave of absence to work on a novel. And you're like, oh, that's not good.
That's not good.
Then you find out like 2 weeks later, the wealthy wife is divorcing him. And then you find out that he was actually married 3 times. They never mentioned the fact that he was married when he arrived in Minnesota. And the next thing you know, 3 weeks later, I see an article that was published in the LA Times that he was marrying somebody. I'm like, oh, who is this person? I look it up. It's the daughter of a professor at the University of Minnesota. And I'm like, Oh, there's all these layers that you're just kind of like, wow, now I understand why he vanished off the face of the earth.
So, Bobak, tell me about your collection of buildings. Behind you, you've got a wonderful bookshelf, at least one bookshelf, of these building replicas. How long you been doing? Oh, wow, that's more than one shelf. Holy cow.
Yeah, I have been, as I mentioned earlier, I was lucky that my parents could take me around the world. And, everyone has the souvenirs they like. My mom liked to collect those spoons. Apparently, some people still do. But I always loved seeing replicas of buildings. And so, I got the typical ones, like the Eiffel Tower, the Statue of Liberty, the things that you tend to get. Like probably the most timeless one is the Empire State Building, right? So as I traveled over the years, I've gotten more and more. And then over time, I'm like, you know what? I'm really into these buildings. I'm going to get more of them. And so I started to find people who make all kinds of structures, not necessarily the most touristy ones, but ones that are of interest. And I love to try and collect them on the same scale. But I've learned things about all kinds of things. Like the Japanese are really into gachapon, which are these capsule toys that you can get out of dispensing machines. For a while there, some of the companies were making unbelievably good replicas of some of these structures, where they're actually to scale. One of them did a church by Tado Ando, and I'm like, what? All right, a modernist work. And oh my gosh, the Kenzo Kuma had a lineup where they did like 6 of his buildings. I'm actually going to see. I'm heading to Japan actually in a couple of weeks. I'm going to get to see one of the buildings that I haven't seen since I was last there 15 years ago. But yeah, it's just one of these things. I love buildings. I love the tactileness of holding it, of seeing it. I try to collect many of them by the same scale, so you can kind of see, like here in the Twin Cities, IDS Center by Philip Johnson is completely dwarfed by something like the Burj Khalifa, or the Tokyo Skytree, and it is absolutely fantastic to kind of see these things.
You can find that map at docomomo-us-mn.org/modern-registry. Good luck. Type it all in.
Or just Minnesota Modern Map. You'll find it.
Yeah. Bobak, thanks so much for joining me. This has been fun.
Absolutely. Anytime.
Architect and merry-go-round enthusiast Spencer Luckey is the president of Luckey Climbers, the firm known for its gravity-defying climbing sculptures in museums and public spaces around the world. A Yale graduate,
Go Bulldogs,
and the son of visionary designer Tom Luckey, Spencer took the reins of the family business in 2006 and continues its legacy of play, blending art and architecture into bold, interactive environments for kids and curious adults. Spencer Luckey's specialty got George thinking back to his own childhood.
When I was growing up, there was a park, one of the oldest parks in the country, called Pullen Park in Raleigh, North Carolina. And you could go play there. They had a train that went around the park. They had a carousel. They had these little boats you could pop into. But what was most fascinating was they had a fire truck, a real fire engine that all the kids could clamber over. They also had a real jet, a World War II trainer jet that kids could climb over. And that was great. That was in the 60s and the 70s. And somewhere in the 70s, parents got all upset because people were scraping their knees on the jet or falling off the thing. And so they replaced all these wonderfully exciting playground equipment with these generic blobs that really the kids were not excited about at all, and nobody would play on them. You would go back to the park and you would see this. Our guest today, Spencer Luckey, has been creating some wonderful playground equipment that is interesting and fascinating, and he has some definite opinions on how to make these things interesting for kids. Welcome, Spencer.
Hi there, George.
So how do you make playground equipment interesting for kids to want to climb on, other than these blobs they were putting out in the 80s?
Well, I think that kids really appreciate aesthetics, as your story suggests. Kids don't want to be talked down to. I think that there are, plenty of dumb little versions of jets and fire engines out there that kids don't see as jets or fire engines and just see as monkey bars or whatever. And that any attempt at bringing sort of a strong agenda to a playground and having kids abide by it is just a fool's errand. So I prefer the idea that kids are allowed to just be kids and create their own agendas and bring their own little narratives to the playground. and then just explore like you might in a fighter jet. I'm sure that there were plenty of amazing things that you found and learned in the process. Probably nothing is made more efficiently than an airplane, right? And a fire truck also has incredible sort of utilitarian aspects that I think have lessons embedded in them. And so these dumbed down versions just are sort of, they lack integrity. And I think kids, when they reach a certain age, start to understand this, and they see that all of these pieces of playground equipment are coded in a way that obliges them to sort of dismiss their fledgling maturity. I mean, I kind of look at childhood as the project of gaining, rights, like the right to cross the street without holding your mom's hand, or the right to tie your own shoes, the right to face forward in the car, the right to sit in the front seat. I mean, it's all pretty significant. And all of that gets undermined if you go to the playground and have yourself a good time on the fake pirate ship or whatever. And you know what I mean? And so that's one aspect. But then the other aspect is that I think that, similar to your fighter jet, I think that there is a kind of tectonic reality to the built environment that's ignored in so many instances. And so much stuff that's made for kids, it's like the decorated shed. And it has a facade that means something, but behind it, there's nothing. I'm just trying to make kids and people more generally, adults included. I'm an equal opportunity designer.
Oh, absolutely. When you go to your website, luckyclimbers.com, there's playground equipment there I want to just run out and go play on. I mean, it's fascinating.
Well, thank you very much. So yeah, it's about trying to remind people that they can feel good about themselves, that humanity does beautiful, incredible, elegant things. And it's not this simplistic, sort of mercenary, bottom line kind of exercise all over the place. People can have fun and feel good about themselves. And some of the things that people make are really beautiful. I mean, I'm not in any way throwing shade on, there's some incredible engineering marvels going on in the world right now. And I'm just trying to cater to kids for the most part and remind them that beautiful things do happen. It's all over the place, and they can look at that, and it's just sort of flesh and bones, and you can see the whole thing and how it all works. And it's, very clearly sort of obsessed over and crafted.
So where are some places that people might find your creations? They could go look at them for themselves. What are some well-known public spots?
Well, we've done projects in 17 countries. So, literally all over the world. The sun never sets on Lucky Climbers. If you happen to be out in Honolulu, there's a mall out there called the Ala Moana Mall. And then in Southern California, there's a beautiful mall called the Irvine Spectrum Center. And there's a Lucky Climber there that's pretty large and great. I have friends that live in Southern California that complain that their kids spend upwards of 2 hours in there. On the East Coast, we've got a really big project at the Boston Children's Museum, another one at the Liberty Science Center in Jersey City, right off the southern tip of Manhattan, and at the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia. We're currently working on a project in Carmel, Indiana, which is a suburb of Indianapolis. Mm-hmm. We've actually done several projects around Indianapolis, most notably in Columbus, Indiana. I'm sure you're aware.
Great epicenter of modernist architecture.
Incredible honor to work there. And we're doing a project right now in Chicago at Garfield Park Conservatory. It's a big old greenhouse kind of structure. Yeah, it's going to be amazing. Yeah, so those are some highlights. We've also got a project in Belfast, Ireland. There's one at the Chinese National Children's Center in Beijing. There's one at a mall in Moscow, the Science Center Singapore, Gyeonggi Children's Museum in South Korea.
You are all over the place.
For sure. And on cruise ships, so, we're mobile.
Oh, yeah. Well, tell me about the Chuck E. Cheese story.
Oh.
I want you to share this with our listeners.
Well, I'm glad you asked, because it really mines the depths of my depravities. But anyway, so we get a call from Chuck E. Cheese. They wanted a climber, and they didn't have a huge budget, but I learned very quickly through an internet search that they had 600 restaurants, including their Pied Piper pizza parlor. So I immediately did the math and thought, oh, wow, I could turn into a multimillionaire just this one job alone. I better knock it out of the park. So I devised this scheme to make a very complicated, but I thought very beautiful little climber. But the riddle was it had to fit through this foyer and get tipped down this way, that way, and all this. It was a very complicated thing. And so I designed this thing, and then they came up to visit and kick the tires. And the guy, it turned out, that I was dealing with was this guy that his first job was at Chuck E. Cheese, popping the air bubbles in the pizza at Chuck E. Cheese. So, I'm based out of New Haven, Connecticut. We have the world's greatest pizza, as I'm sure you're aware.
Yes, I've heard.
So I took him to, they're sort of temperamental, the pizza parlors, but I took him to this one called Modern Pizza, which is, in the top 3. And just, not to troll him, but to sort of see, I don't know, they're from Texas. And I just thought this would be kind of funny. And it was funny. There was this guy at the table next door, he was this just speed freak character, and he was driving up to Boston or something. And he just stopped in this Modern Pizza because he heard it was so great. And he just wouldn't shut up. And he had like 3 pizzas in front of him. And he was just gorging and just going on and on about how fabulous the pizza was. And all I could think was like, has anyone ever been to Chuck E. Cheese and had this kind of reaction? It's just, anyway, so we made this climber for them. It was all kind of prefabricated here. We boxed it up, shipped it to down there, and tipped it, squoze it through the door. It had to do this whole like little dance as it made its way through. Each piece was highly choreographed. One had to do a cartwheel, the other one had to do a barrel roll, and they put it in place. And then they ordered another one, and it turns out they didn't really like the first one. It was not, it was sort of too artsy and fartsy. It had like chrome on it and this weird pattern that I sort of ripped off of this beautiful painting at the British Art Museum here in New Haven. So the next one was kind of a dumbed down version. It was sort of like the Vulcan one. And that's when the conversation ended. Just recently, they ripped the first one out, and they called me and asked me if I could come and put it back together. And I told them how much that would cost. And it's just like, it was over. Anyway, I don't think I'm going to be doing business with Chuck E. Cheese anytime soon and becoming a multimillionaire that way. But
so what didn't they
the
like?
The funniest thing about the story was right after I got the phone call, I had to pick up my kid at school, and I thought, oh, he's going to be so excited. He was 9 years old at the time, and I thought, oh, it's going to be amazing. I'm going to tell him he's going to be so proud of me. He gets in the car, and I go, Clyde, guess what? I got a job at Chuck E. Cheese. And he went, oh, no, Chuck E. Cheese? That place is the worst. The worst birthday party I ever went to was at Chuck E. Cheese. So then I dragged his sad ass over to Chuck E. Cheese.
Well, I've heard that they've not been doing the best as a national company, and they got rid of all those animatronic characters, the ones that made them famous.
The one that made them famous.
Well, there was a band, right? There was a bunch of characters up there on the stage.
I don't know, the one that I'm familiar with is the Rat.
Okay.
The damnedest mascot.
Well, there was Ratatouille. He had a whole movie named after him.
Yeah, but that was irony. They were peddling an irony. There's no irony at Chuck E. Cheese. I've been there.
Well, do you want to go public for the first time with your involvement with a band called Funk Bucket?
Well, it's not really a band. It's just me.
It's just you.
Yeah, I've been a musician all my life, and I was actually having a little trouble with my hands, recurring tendonitis. And it's about 10 years ago. And I just thought, I don't know, I need to make a record so that I can record where I'm at as a musician. So I did. So that one was called Piggy Snacks. And that was done on GarageBand, which is an app on Apple computer. The other record's called Selfie, and I recorded that entirely on my iPhone. And it's just, like voice memos.
And where can people hear these albums?
On Spotify.
Spotify?
Yep. Funk Bucket, one word. It's not for everyone. In my professional life, I try to be very accessible. And I sort of think about what I do is like pop music. Mm-hmm. I try to do something that, everyone can kind of tap their foot to. But Funk Bucket's, I don't know, it's sort of my alter ego.
Okay. The Jekyll Hyde sort of thing going on there.
Well, I don't know. Maybe it's Felix and Oscar.
There you go. That's a better one. With the playground equipment,
one of the things I loved about the fire engine way back was the fact that it was so popular that you would have like 8 kids on it. And the kids would kind of automatically know how to switch jobs, right? So every a minute or two, there'd be a new driver. There'd be 2 kids hanging on the back, like they were on their way to the fire. There'd be 2 kids on the top of the truck, trying to move where the hose attachments were supposed to be. And of course, we were all enacting the great fire of Raleigh that was going to be happening, that we were going to go to see. So I was wondering, is there a kind of interactive team dynamic that you see on some of your playground equipment?
Well, I'd like to think that I've heard kids speak in the same sort of hushed tones that adults use at fine art museums. So I don't know whether that speaks to your idea, but
tell me what that is. Yeah.
Well, they're like very respectful. I don't know. I don't see a lot of climbers in action. I used to go to openings, but nobody seemed to care that I was there, so I stopped going. It's
market research. It's your job.
I suppose, but I'm going to reform myself and get back into it because I think it's kind of funny. Anyway, kids, big kids getting helped by little kids. Hey, look at this, check it out, follow me. I don't know, there's this one climber in Philadelphia that's made out of glass, and it has this crazy light show and soundtrack, and it kind of reaches this crescendo and then goes completely black for a few seconds. It's meant to simulate brain neurons.
Yeah.
But it's really outrageous aesthetically when you're in there. It's really animated and crazy. And when I was in there one time, when it went black, the kids, they all scrambled their positions, and it was this crazy game of tag, and they were like waiting for the lights to all turn off.
Yeah.
So that then they could change their positions, and the game would change again.
That's what I'm talking about.
That's what I'm talking about. We have this new climber coming out that's going to be really outrageous. We figured out a few years ago how to put lights inside of our plastic panels. And so we've found these pixel strips, they're called, and they're these LED strips. They're really bright, so they shine through the translucent plastic panel platforms, that you can really program them and get them to do all this wonderful stuff. And so I'm really into the idea of turning the climber. Maybe Funk Bucket and I are going to cooperate on this, but
there you go.
Into a huge musical instrument.
What a collab right there.
Yeah, right. So, this one has 68 or something platforms. So, I could have it be like all pretty much monotone except for a few 7 or 8 platforms. And whenever a kid is on one of those 7 or 8 platforms, it would start to sort of make the voices of a chord. And then maybe there's another color that gives some other kinds of textures and different instruments and stuff. I don't know how many children's museums you've been to, but they have these like insane recurring soundtracks.
Yeah.
There'll be like a virtual soccer game or something going on. And so they like cheer like every 3 or 4 minutes. And it's maddening if you ever have to work in that kind of place.
I guess it's like being at Disney when they're playing It's a Small World After All over and over.
Yeah, probably. But to have it be much more, to change a lot more and to be much more interactive, but to give that same kind of objective. I don't want to turn it into a game because then there'll be kids, tearing around in there. Another idea is, to have it be like Simon. So you have to find a chip, the lit up chip, and then go to the next lit up chip. And maybe you have to repeat the sequence or something.
Yeah, that's cool.
But it's hard, when you have this climbers would have 30 or 40 kids in it all trying to go to the same platform. I don't know. The game isn't exactly worked out, but that's why I like the musical instrument ideas because it would encourage some sort of cooperation. Maybe they don't even realize that it's really happening. You know what I mean? So it's just like their movements kind of create this music, and then some kids would realize that they've triggered something.
I would love to see that.
I'm really looking forward to it.
Spencer, thanks so much for talking with me. The website is luckyclimbers.com.
Thank you so much for having me on your podcast. What an honor.
We'll close out this week with music from Lenore Raphael, an internationally celebrated pianist, Steinway artist, and award-winning composer. She sold out iconic venues like Dizzy's Club at Lincoln Center, the Blue Note, Birdland, and Ronnie Scott's, and she's graced major jazz festivals from London to Johannesburg to Tel Aviv. With 10 CDs on swing and fox music, she's also the jazz director at New York's West 64th Street Jazz Club and the Haley Cultural Arts Center in Apex, North Carolina. Here's Lenore performing If You Could See Me Now.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs. Okay, Tom, if that's really your name, wrap us up.
Okay. Well, I could always ask OpenAI for a new one. Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 25,000 significant modernist houses, and access 5 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song is performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl, with guest research by Bobby Morris. Conversational is her middle name, or it could be Clementine. We really don't know. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and I'll be back soon with another human intelligence crafted edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.